Hello, thank you for being here and welcome to the June 2024 edition of our NRCS Conservation Outcomes webinar series. And I'll go ahead and be the first to say it, Happy Pollinator Week. My name is Elizabeth Creech-Thomas, and I'm a Natural Resources Communication Specialist with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS. We host this webinar series to share key findings, data, and tools to support farmers and other agricultural producers, conservation partners, and researchers in pursuing science-backed, data-driven voluntary conservation efforts across the nation. We're going to share just a few logistics. So the first one, if you want to learn about these webinars, we host several each year. You can subscribe to our Conservation Outcomes Gov delivery list for email updates. And we're going to share shortly a direct link to subscribe in the meeting chat. And you can also at any time subscribe with the link that's available at the top of our Conservation Outcomes webinar series webpage. So to access that page, and you're going to hear me say this address several times today, but visit nrcs.usda.gov/conservation-outcomes-webinar. And you'll see the link at the top. To subscribe, you'll put in your email address. You'll be given the opportunity to provide a password, but you don't have to. And you can subscribe for conservation outcomes under the conservation category. I also want to answer a few commonly asked questions in advance. So the first one, can I access live captioning? The answer is absolutely yes. So there is a More feature in the top right corner of Teams. If you select that option, you'll be able to select language and speech. And under that is the option to turn on live captioning. Another question is, can I ask a question? And the answer to that is also yes, please do. So during our presentation today, please type questions into the chat at any time. You do not have to wait till the end. And Charlie Rewa, who is our lead for the Conservation Effects Assessment Project Wildlife component, will monitor the chat and will facilitate a Q&A at the end. And then, how do I access presentation slides, additional resources, and the webinar recording? All of those will be available on our NRCS Conservation Outcomes webinar series webpage. That's the same URL I mentioned earlier. And you will see a one-pager available in the chat shortly. Our presentation slides and a recording of this webinar will be available on that page by early July. And with that, it is time to get started. So I am thrilled to introduce Izzy Hill. She's USDA's Honeybee and Pollinator Research Coordinator. Izzy, thank you so much for your time today. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. And again, happy Pollinator Week, everybody. As said, my name is Izzy Hill, and I am the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Honeybee and Pollinator Research Coordinator. So we work with about 14 labs and 20 offices here at USDA, alongside sister agencies and, of course, our stakeholder groups, to do what we can to support pollinator health. And I am thrilled to be kicking off today's webinar. So just a little bit of background before we get started. If you didn't already know, we have over 100 crops and 40 seed crops that depend on pollinators here in the United States, at least in part. We often think of pollinators like honeybees, but of course we've got a lot of other species of pollinators like wild bees, insects, birds, bats, and the list goes on and on. We actually have over 4,000 species of native bees here in the United States. So a lot of diversity when we are talking about pollination. And in addition, it's really important to think about how much this means in terms of the value of our food production. And it is everything. We wouldn't starve without pollinators, but we would be lacking many of the foods that are incredibly nutritionally important to us. So it's very important to us, both from an agricultural perspective, but also from an ecosystem perspective, to support these healthy populations across our landscapes. So we obviously need pollinators, but they need us too. And they're facing a wide range of stressors. We tend to think about it across 5 groups. The first is forage habitat and nutrition. We think about environmental stressors like pesticides and climatic stress. We also have pests and pathogens that can be impactful. And we also have to think about things like genetics and breeding, which sometimes is less obvious, but critical to the overall health of our pollinators. So USDA, as I mentioned, supports pollinators in their critical role in quite a few ways. So obviously research, we do data collections, diagnostic services, pollinator health and monitoring, voluntary programs, and also conservation pollinator habitat programs, both on private lands and public lands, but we also want to do what we can to support those habitats everywhere. And finally, we also have quite a few pollinator grants that are available through our different offices. So changing gears a little bit to specifically focus on SEEP, which is the Conservation Effects Assessment Program. This plays a really important role in our pollinator conservation efforts across our nation's farms, ranches, and private forests. This is a multi-agency effort led by NRCS, or the Natural Resource Conservation Service, to quantify conservation outcomes and support data-driven conservation decision-making across working lands. And so SEEP collaborates with scientific partners and federal agencies and members of academia, such as today's presenter, and to assess the outcomes of voluntary conservation efforts over time and strengthen science-backed data-driven decision-making. So the Conservation Outcomes webinar series provides an opportunity to share SEEP findings with you and our conservation colleagues and partners, researchers, ag producers, and other land managers. So for today, our webinar is going to focus on a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, which is providing pollinator benefits through voluntary conservation. We know USDA's NRCS and our Farm Service Agency deliver voluntary conservation programs that support pollinators, but the real question is, can we quantify those conservation outcomes? And equally important, how do we maximize the benefits? So SEEP and researchers at Virginia Tech collaborated on a study to answer these questions and more. And we're excited about these findings, and we think that they'll be quite useful in prioritizing conservation efforts that will deliver the greatest benefits to pollinators and production agriculture across the United States. So for the main webinar presentation, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Elissa Olimpi, who works on the pollinator assessment as a postdoc researcher at Virginia Tech, and Charlie Rewa, NRCS lead for SEEP wildlife assessments, will be moderating questions following her presentation. So thank you again for joining us, and Dr. Olimpi, the floor is yours.
Thanks for the great introduction, Izzy. I'm just going to get set up with my slides here. Okay, well, let's get started. I'm going to be talking today about prioritizing private lands for USDA-funded pollinator habitat enhancements. This project would not be possible without broad collaborations across several USDA agencies, Sarah Carpenter at Virginia Tech, many folks that supported computational and the statistical side of this work, as well as a lot of help with accessing data and data processing on the USDA side. I also just want to acknowledge that I'm going to be talking about two different bodies of work today. The work that Izzy mentioned before was funded by NRCS SEEP, and then I'm also going to be talking about another USDA program, the Farm Service Agency Conservation Reserve Program, and that work was funded by a USDA NIFA grant. And then as a brief overview to the talk, we'll do a little bit of background about pollinators, but I think Izzy actually covered a lot of that, so thank you. I'll discuss project objectives, an expert elicitation survey, and then I'll go into more of our quantitative methods, results for NRCS, and then a bit of a comparison, including both NRCS and CRP, or Conservation Reserve Program results. We'll talk about management implications, policy implications, and then some next steps and final products. And so first, as you recently heard, pollinators face steep declines, yet they're very important to US agriculture as well as many other wild species. The good news is that USDA-funded pollinator habitat enhancements can supplement pollinator resources. So by adding different types of non-crop or semi-natural habitat, USDA practices can provide both floral resources for pollinators and nesting resources for pollinators, such as bare ground for some types of wild bees. And then in turn, by supplementing pollinator resources, these practices also protect pollination services. And as a little bit of background about these programs, one, we have the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Agency, or NRCS, and there are two main programs that the practices I'll discuss today fall under. The first is the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP. The second is the Conservation Stewardship Program, or CSP. And then the other program that I'll discuss today is part of the USDA Farm Service Agency, or FSA. It's the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP. And I won't talk about details about these programs too much as far as how to participate, but you could visit your local USDA Service Center to learn more about these opportunities on working lands. And then to just give you some background on the different types of practices that this presentation will cover today, when I say that there are many different kinds of practices, they kind of fall into these two groups for supporting pollinators. The first is wildflower plantings. So having a diversity of species that are selected specifically to provide floral resources for pollinators across their foraging season. An example of this would be NRCS Practice 420, or wildlife habitat planting, which can be geared towards pollinators. And then under the CRP, Practice CP42, pollinator habitat, which is also explicitly designed for pollinators. And then a complementary practice is just the creation or restoration of semi-natural habitat. And by semi-natural habitats, I mean any kind of grasslands, forests, shrublands, wetlands. Those are the many types of different semi-natural habitats that I'll be discussing today. An NRCS practice that touches on semi-natural habitat is Practice 386, or field borders. So adding non-crop vegetation at the edges of crop fields and farm borders. And then under the CRP, Practice CP2 is native grasses. So what that might look like in the picture in the lower right is that you can see those circles represent crop fields where the irrigation infrastructure can reach. But then in these pink areas that aren't as readily accessible for the irrigation infrastructure, these could be planted in native grasses or another type of semi-natural habitat that could provide additional resources for pollinators. And then this brings me to our first question about how we might prioritize these pollinator habitat enhancements. We'd want to know, where are pollinator habitat enhancements most beneficial? And so the first way that we'll address this question is that we know that, or theory predicts, in landscapes where the expected conservation benefits are greatest. And so in simple landscapes, like this aerial imagery that you see here, this landscape has probably about 5% surrounding semi-natural habitat. And so any landscape that has between 1 and 20% semi-natural habitat would be considered a simple landscape. And the idea is here that there's enough existing habitat for pollinators that there are species present, there are species pools in the surrounding landscape, but there's not so much semi-natural habitat that adding a little bit more won't make a difference. So in those habitats or those landscapes where there's already more semi-natural habitat, adding a little more may not meaningfully augment pollinator resources. The second way that we can look at this question is that pollinator habitat enhancements would be most beneficial in regions that are the most vulnerable to the loss of pollination services. And so let's unpack what that vulnerability might look like. The first part of it has to do with both the supply and the demand for pollination services. And so the supply part, you could think of it as how much existing semi-natural habitat is there in the landscape, and what kind of resources do those different land cover classes provide for pollinators. And then the second part of this is the demand for pollination services. So a crop like blueberries has a high dependence on pollinators. And so you could have a high mismatch between the supply and demand if you have a crop that has a high dependence on pollinators, but at the same time, you don't have that many pollinators because there's not that much habitat for them, or not that much high quality habitat for them in the surrounding landscape. The other part of this vulnerability has to do with semi-natural habitats. And so we look at this in two different ways. One, we'll look at recent semi-natural habitat loss over since 2008. And then we will also look at projected semi-natural habitat loss into the future. And so these are kind of the different components of vulnerability that will be a theme throughout this talk. And so I mentioned those, the projected semi-natural habitat loss. So I will talk about two future scenarios, and the maps that I'm going to present here represent the proportion or the percent of semi-natural habitat that we would expect to see converted to other land uses, either to development or agricultural expansion. And so in this top map here, the first scenario that we're looking at is sort of a middle of the road scenario. This is SSP2, or Shared Socioeconomic Pathway, which is just kind of like the socioeconomic story surrounding this future scenario. And it's RCP 4.5. RCP is the radiative concentration pathway, so this has to do with the levels of greenhouse gases. And so here you can see areas in red mean that there's more habitat loss. Areas in green could even signify cropland abandonment, and there's more semi-natural habitat in those areas. The second scenario looks quite a bit different. This is a scenario that is more biofuel intensive. So here, there are increased carbon prices, which are intended to limit those greenhouse gases and promote bioenergy production. But promoting bioenergy production means expanding the agricultural footprint to grow more bioenergy crops. And so here you see much more of those areas in red. So we would expect higher rates of semi-natural habitat conversion under this second scenario. Let's walk through our objectives for this project, because there are several. The first is that we want to define and characterize focal NRCS pollinator practices. There are very many NRCS practices, so we wanted to know first which are most important for pollinators. Second, we want to quantify the contribution of NRCS pollinator practices to semi-natural habitat and the national supply of pollinators. Third, investigate if NRCS pollinator practices are being prioritized in those landscapes where expected conservation benefits are greatest. Fourth, we want to test if the distribution of NRCS practices is predicted by vulnerability to the loss of pollination services. And then finally, we'll identify target priority regions that have both a low NRCS enrollment relative to a high vulnerability to the loss of pollination services. First, our expert elicitation survey. So this has to do with objective 1, defining and characterizing those NRCS practices most relevant to pollinators. We used both a focus group to come up with a rough list of practices that are often used for pollinator conservation. This group consisted of staff from NRCS as well as Xerces Society. And once we had this list, we had our experts rank each practice, and then we settled on a total of 51 NRCS pollinator practices. 11 of those practices are core and supporting practices, which will be a category that I also talk about throughout this presentation. And those are the practices that are most commonly used or have the highest value when it comes to pollinator conservation. A subset of these practices also represent the creation or restoration of semi-natural habitats. Okay, So for our second objective, we wanted to quantify the contribution of NRCS practices to semi-natural habitat and pollinator supply. To do this, we first obtained spatial data from the National Planning and Agreements Database, or NPAD, and we also considered practice lifespans. So if a practice is expected to only have benefits for a year, we only looked at 1 year of that practice. But for a practice that might have benefits over a longer time horizon, like a hedgerow, we looked at the appropriate lifespan for each practice. These areas in pink represent the data that was pulled from NPAD. So these are land use ID polygons. And then what we did is within each of these pink polygons, we quantified semi-natural habitat. And then we also estimated pollinator supply that was associated with those pink polygons. And the background that you see here is the cropland data layer, where each pixel shows a different type of land cover class or crop type. The first way that we filtered these land use ID polygons was that we wanted polygons where at least half of the area represented a pollinator practice that had been applied. So the way that these data, the database works is that we know that there's a pollinator practice applied within this pink polygon somewhere. We don't know exactly where, but we do know the total area. So after that filtering step, we were left with a little over 700,000 land use IDs. And then we wanted to quantify semi-natural habitat within a 1.5 kilometer buffer, which is ecologically relevant for pollinators. And so we applied a buffer that you can see here in blue to each of those pink polygons and then quantified the amount of semi-natural habitat within the buffer. Next, we evaluated the relationship between NRCS practices and vulnerability. We built a spatial model, which I will walk you through our covariates and response and model structure next. So our covariates, first, we used pollination mismatch, which again is the relative supply and demand for pollination services. We modeled pollinator supply using the INVEST model, which is a model that's publicly available. It was developed by the Natural Capital Project, and it relies on land cover classes that are associated with different values that signify the extent to which they provide resources for pollinators. And then for demand, we estimated the demand for pollination services using crop-specific pollination dependence. So again, like crop like a blueberry or many fruit crops have a high dependence on pollinators, so they would have you would have higher demand associated with those areas. And then other crops such as soy and cotton have a lower dependence on pollinators, so they would have a lower score. And then we looked at recent semi-natural habitat loss between 2008 and 2021. And then we also looked at projected semi-natural habitat loss at 2 different time points in the future, the near future, 2050, and then an end of century scenario, 2100. And then for each time point, we also looked at 2 different plausible futures, the middle of the road scenario and the biofuel intensive future. So those represent the 2 maps with projected land use that I showed a few slides back. And then our model response was percent NRCS enrollment. And so we calculated this as the area of NRCS practices applied divided by the eligible area. And so here for eligible area, we considered everything except for high and medium intensity development, open water, and public lands. For this part of the analysis, we focused on those NRCS practices that were only on private lands, even though about 3.6% of them, so a small percentage, were actually on public lands. And then here's our model structure. We have percent NRCS enrollment as a function of pollination mismatch, recent semi-natural habitat conversion, projected semi-natural habitat conversion. We also included the state just to account for any differences in how programs might be administered at the state level, as well as working lands for wildlife initiatives, which are areas that NRCS does prioritize for conservation for many different reasons, sometimes at the ecosystem or at the species level. And then for our last objective, to identify target priority regions, we built a vulnerability index. So we used pollination mismatch and then recent and projected semi-natural habitat conversion to come up with an index that reflects vulnerability to loss of pollination services. Then we compared that index to percent NRCS enrollment and asked which regions have high vulnerability to the loss of pollination services relative to low NRCS enrollment. And so moving on to our results. These maps show the contribution, which could either be the creation of new semi-natural habitat or the restoration of semi-natural habitat, the contribution of NRCS practice area to semi-natural habitat and pollinator supply. In this set of maps, these are focused on semi-natural habitat. So when we looked across those 51 NRCS pollinator practices, we found that they contribute 2.5% to all semi-natural habitat. And areas in darker orange means NRCS practices had a relatively higher contribution. And then the map on the right here in B, this shows core and supporting practices. So there were 11 practices that were most relevant to pollinators. They contribute 0.5% to all semi-natural habitat. And you can see a little bit different patterns in how the practices and their contribution is distributed. So in map A, we have a lot of contribution across the central US. In the second map, those core and supporting practices, a lot of them are in the central US, but then we also have sort of this band across the southeast. Next, these are very similar maps, but instead of showing contribution to semi-natural habitat, these maps show contribution to the national supply of pollinators. And so when we look at all 51 pollinator practices, they contribute 3.9% to the national supply of pollinators. And I should mention here that we are specifically focused on wild bees for all of these estimates, but many of these estimates are also, you might expect to see the same kinds of general patterns for other pollinators. And so here we have a 3.9% contribution of all those practices, but then in map B for the core and supporting practices, we have a 1% contribution. And again, you might notice different patterns. A lot of those core and supporting practices are here in the Mississippi River Valley, again in the southeast and central US. And to some extent, you see the same patterns, but just with a heavier concentration across the central US when we have that expanded group of practices. Something really important I want to point out here, a key finding is that the contribution of practices to pollinators is very high relative to the contribution to semi-natural habitat. So as you might remember in this slide before, these practices contribute 2.5% to all semi-natural habitats, yet they contribute 3.9% to the national supply of pollinators. So the way to interpret this is that those practices have a higher relative contribution than like your average semi-natural habitat in the US. So they really are pollinator enhancements doing what they're intended to do. Next, these two figures show semi-natural habitat surrounding NRCS practices. So this is related to our objective that we would expect the greatest benefits for practices in simple landscapes with between 1 and 20% surrounding semi-natural habitat. So the way to read these graphs is that across the x-axis, you see the percent surrounding semi-natural habitat. The dashed lines and the area highlighted in green, that's sort of our target simple landscape. So that's between 1 and 20%. And then on the y-axis, density is just showing how practices are distributed across these landscape types. So for all NRCS pollinator practices, we do see a peak in that sort of simple landscape range. And then we see a second peak over here closer to maybe 80 or 90% surrounding semi-natural habitat. We see a similar pattern in B for core and supporting pollinator practices, except the highest peak here really is in these simple landscapes with a secondary peak over here when landscapes have more surrounding semi-natural habitat. And so many of these practices are designed for agricultural landscapes where you would expect not to have that much surrounding semi-natural habitat. But there are other practices for a variety of reasons where it would make sense to have those practices located in landscapes that already do have a good amount of semi-natural habitat. So here, we're really talking about working lands and agricultural landscapes in this green stripe, but there are a lot of reasons that these practices should be deployed in a variety of landscapes. So that's kind of the caveat here. Next, the relationship between NRCS practices and vulnerability. So here, I just broke down our pollinator mismatch into the two components of pollinator supply and pollinator demand. In this map on the left, in map A, areas in purple show a higher supply of pollinators. So across a lot of these public lands and protected areas in the west, you would expect to have a higher supply of pollinators, and you would expect a lower supply in some of the most prominent agricultural regions. For the map of pollinator demand, I've flipped the colors. So what I want you to notice is that there's an area of orange over here that indicates a high demand for pollination services. And in map A, that same area in orange is a low supply of pollinators. So these maps help to make the point that the mismatch is pretty apparent in these orange areas where you probably have more agriculture, a higher demand for pollinators, but at the same time, agriculture is limiting pollinator habitat. In the next slide, I'm going to put these two together. So instead of pollinator supply and demand, we'll take a look at pollinator mismatch. Pollinator mismatch is this map shown in pink and green. So as you can see, areas in pink have a higher mismatch. So here, you're more likely to have a higher demand for pollination services and a lower supply. So you'll notice the Northern Great Plains, Mississippi River Valley, California Central Valley. So this is our map of pollinator mismatch. These four maps represent the most important variables in the spatial model. And so map A is just percent NRCS enrollment. So areas in darker green mean that more eligible land is enrolled in NRCS practices. So really we see a lot of practices across the central US as well as the eastern US. And then we already talked about pollination mismatch in map B. And then map C and D show semi-natural habitat conversion. Map C shows semi-natural habitat loss between 2008 and 2021. So we see in red, there's been more semi-natural habitat loss in the Northern Great Plains and Midwest. And there are a few areas in green where perhaps we've seen cropland abandonment and we see an increase in semi-natural habitat. In map D, areas in red, and this is for our biofuel intensive future in the year 2050, areas in red mean that there is higher rates of projected semi-natural habitat conversion. Again, a lot of that is in the central part of the country where you might expect there to be an increase in bioenergy crop production. And so if you just kind of take a step back and look at these maps, our models are really asking, does this distribution of NRCS enrollment mirror any of these components of vulnerability? And at first glance, yeah, it does look like areas in darker green in map A correspond to areas in pink in map B. And even to some extent where we've seen recent semi-natural habitat loss, but not so much projected semi-natural habitat loss. So next, I want to walk you through our modeling results. So moving beyond sort of these visual patterns to a more quantitative test of those relationships. Okay, this graph shows the coefficient estimates from our model asking about the relationship between NRCS practices and vulnerability. So here, this dashed line is just 0. So anything that's a positive coefficient estimate means that that component of vulnerability is aligned with NRCS practice distribution. So we see a significant positive relationship between pollination mismatch and the distribution of NRCS practices. These filled circles represent significant effects, and then the two different colors represent the two future scenarios. So we see a strong positive correlation for pollination mismatch, as well as for recent semi-natural habitat conversion, which were the patterns that were most apparent from the maps. Although this pattern for recent semi-natural habitat loss is not as strong as for pollination mismatch. And then we don't really see any alignment for projected semi-natural habitat conversion, keeping in mind that this is not an explicit goal of any of these programs or practices. This is more of just a way to think about if we know which semi-natural habitats are more vulnerable to conversion in the future, we can think about prioritizing protection in those areas. And then we see a positive and significant correlation between those working lands for wildlife initiatives and the distribution of practices, which is the intent of those initiatives. So that's what we would expect to see there. Next, these maps show how we would think about targeting priority areas with high vulnerability and low NRCS enrollment. So in map A, this is the vulnerability index. So we've put together pollination mismatch and then recent and projected semi-natural habitat loss. And areas in blue show higher vulnerability to the loss of pollination services. In map B, we're showing both pollination vulnerability as well as percent nrcs enrollment. So areas in teal, which is what I want you to focus on in map B, these areas in teal have a high vulnerability to loss of pollination services relative to a low nrcs enrollment rate. And then in map C, I've just cleaned it up and only I'm showing you those areas in teal. And I've circled a few areas that could be considered target priority areas. And next, I'll walk you through a few of those stories just to help you understand what's going on there that would result in a higher vulnerability to loss of pollination services. So first, let's go to Central Washington. This map here, the different colors represent different crop types in this river basin. And so a lot of these pinks and darker reds represent fruit crops such as pears, cherries, and apples that have a higher dependence on pollinators. So here we have intensive ag limiting the supply of pollinators, fruit trees with a higher pollination dependence, contributing to pollination mismatch. We've also seen recent semi-natural habitat conversion rates above 10% and 5 to 15% projected semi-natural habitat conversion in the future due to cropland expansion and development. Now here, there is pretty high NRCS enrollment. It's just not in the exact same areas where we see the pollinator mismatch. So across the broader region, approximately 30% of the eligible lands are enrolled in NRCS practices, and most of those are core and supporting practices, so those most relevant to pollinators. Next, this is a different story. In the Southern Great Plains, we're looking at Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. Again, the different colors, yellow, green, and red, represent some of the dominant crop types, such as soy, corn, and cotton. In the previous slide, we also had intensive agriculture limiting pollinator supply in Washington. So that's one similarity between Washington and Southern Great Plains. But the difference here is that in this landscape, you have these large areas of crops with low dependence on pollinators, as opposed to in Washington, we saw crops that were smaller areas or covering smaller areas, so lower acreage, but they had a high dependence on pollinators. So either scenario can result in pollination mismatch. Here, there's been about 10% recent semi-natural habitat conversion and projected 5 to 20% semi-natural habitat conversion in the future, which would mostly be due to cropland expansion. Between 10 and 30% of eligible lands are enrolled in NRCS practices, and half of those practices are core and supporting practices most relevant to pollinators. But again, those practices may not be in the exact same areas that have the highest pollination mismatch. So could be surrounding areas a little bit further away from the areas where pollination services are in the highest demand. Next, we'll go to the East Coast, and here we're looking at New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. And this is kind of a hybrid story when it comes to the crop types and pollination mismatch. So first, you have both intensive agriculture as well as development, limiting the supply of pollinators. And then you have both large areas of crops with low pollinator dependence, such as soy. And then you have smaller areas with high pollinator dependence. So up here, this little splotch of blue is blueberries. There has actually been recent increase in semi-natural habitat loss in this area via cropland abandonment. But in the projected future scenario for middle of the road, there's between 10 and 20% projected semi-natural habitat conversion, which would be due to urban and ex-urban expansion, so increased development. About 15% of eligible lands are enrolled in NRCS practices, and most of those are corn supporting practices. So as you might notice across these three examples, there are variable rates of enrollment in NRCS practices. But for those areas that had higher rates of enrollment, the practices may not be adjacent to the areas where the pollination services are needed most. Okay, and next I want to do a little comparison explaining our findings from a past project that I mentioned that focused on the Conservation Reserve Program, and then our findings for NRCS practices. And so I'm just going to walk through each of the covariates in the model here. First, the map on the left, or the figure on the left, shows NRCS results, which you've seen already. So for pollination mismatch, we saw that NRCS practices were aligned with pollination mismatch. But for the Conservation Reserve Program, they were not aligned with pollination mismatch. So here we have a negative significant coefficient estimate. And then next, for recent semi-natural habitat conversion, again, there is alignment between where habitat has been lost and NRCS practices, but we don't see the same result for Conservation Reserve Program. Those practices are not in the areas that have experienced the most recent semi-natural habitat conversion. And then we don't really see any strong patterns when looking across NRCS practices or the CRP when it comes to how practices are distributed with respect to projected future land use scenarios. And again, this is not an explicit goal. There's a lot of variability in which scenario you choose and what that means as far as land use change in the future. But I'm just bringing this up to highlight that if there are areas that we know are more vulnerable to either development or cropland expansion, those are areas where we could consider prioritizing conservation practices so that those lands can remain in semi-natural habitat. And then finally, across both programs, we saw that they were aligned with sort of their own initiatives. So for NRCS, those practices are well aligned with Working Lands for Wildlife initiatives. And for the CRP, those practices are well aligned with conservation priority areas at the state and federal level. And so there are a few differences in these analyses that I want to highlight to kind of talk about these differences. First, for NRCS, we only looked at 51 practices that we know are relevant to pollinators. For the CRP, we looked at all practices, assuming that those practices all either create, enhance, or restore semi-natural habitats. And then for NRCS, as I mentioned before, we considered practice lifespans. So we only considered a practice to be active. It was within sort of its lifespan of when we would expect there to still be benefits. And for the CRP, we considered active contracts, but we may be missing some of the benefits of CRP because once a contract expires, a native grassland may persist and continue to provide benefits for pollinators, which would not be captured in this analysis. And then next, I want to put some of those differences into the framework of just how the practices are distributed across the US. and the differences between the programs that result in these different distributions. So on the left, again, NRCS practices are much more broadly distributed relative to the CRP practices, which are more concentrated in the center of the US. So I guess the NRCS practices are very much geared towards working lands, so on farms, whereas the CRP is a program that relies on removing lands from agricultural production and retiring those environmentally sensitive lands. And so in some cases, it might be that there's a landowner that has prime farmland and the incentive structure is just not set up to retire those lands, nor would we necessarily want to retire prime farmlands and put them into a conservation area as opposed to keeping them in production. Another thing I want to point out is that many of the CRP practices in the Northern Great Plains and Midwest, once those contracts expire, there's evidence to suggest that retiring those practices and bringing those lands back into production has actually been part of the pattern that I showed in the past slide, where we could just go back here for a minute, where CRP practices were not in areas where there's been recent semi-natural habitat conversion. And part of that is just due to having those contracts expire and then that land becoming agricultural production again. So hopefully that provides some context for why we would see these differences in results across these different practices and programs. And so to kind of sum up our results, one, we know that practices are impactful. So NRCS pollinator practices create or enhance semi-natural habitats and contribute to the national supply of pollinators at a higher rate than if those lands were not enrolled in NRCS practices. So if you might recall, NRCS practices contribute 3.9% to the supply of pollinators, but only 2.5% to semi-natural habitat. So they have a higher relative contribution than other semi-natural habitat types. Second, many practices are aligned with needs. So NRCS and CRP contracts, many of those are in landscapes where expected conservation benefits are greatest. So between 20 and 25% of all practices across both of those analyses were in those simple landscapes. And additionally, many NRCS pollinator practices were aligned with pollination mismatch and recent and projected semi-natural habitat loss, so those components of vulnerability, which we saw just for the NRCS analysis. And then finally, opportunities exist to improve spatial targeting. So prioritizing conservation practices in the most vulnerable regions could provide better alignment between programs and pollinator conservation, especially for the CRP. And just to mention another caveat here is that neither of these programs or suites of practices as a whole are specifically intended for pollinator conservation, even though they are incredibly useful for supporting pollinator conservation. The program goals are incredibly diverse and support a variety of conservation objectives beyond just pollinator conservation. And then thinking about management implications for those of you that may be landowners or working with landowners. First, adoption and implementation of pollinator conservation practices should be locally appropriate and use a diversity of native plant species. So the same practice might be applied differently in different regions, might have different seed mixes. Second, both wildflower plantings and other semi-natural habitat, such as grasslands, shrublands, forests, wetlands, they all provide critical resources for pollinators. So it's not just about planting flowers, right? It's about more holistically thinking about how to provide resources for pollinators. And then when prioritizing areas for pollinator conservation at the regional scale, consideration of the existing semi-natural habitat and crop pollination needs can inform decision making. So thinking about where are those areas that have the highest demand for pollination services, and is there existing semi-natural habitat near that particular crop field? For policy implications, first, targeting enrollment in the most vulnerable regions will likely require higher payments to attract landowners in those regions. Another potential tool is increasing eligibility. One way to do this, and I know that there are rare examples, would be to either waive or increase the adjusted gross income limit to allow the participation of larger operations that may be interested in conservation practices, but are not eligible to enroll. And then finally, increased competitiveness for landscape coordination. So when you have a group of landowners in the same area that are working together to sort of scale up those conservation practices, which we know can deliver greater benefits when you scale up and sort of synergize those practices. And then second, more detailed spatial data showing exact practice locations would enable more sophisticated analyses to guide evidence-based conservation strategies. Keeping in mind that there are very real concerns about landowner privacy, but also acknowledging that external collaborations with university partners outside of the USDA, that those collaborations can be incredibly fruitful and provide a diversity of skill sets that can enable these kinds of analyses. And for next steps, we're very open to feedback about how products related to this work can be shared to increase visibility to conservation practitioners. Also, sort of just to pose the question, are there ways to increase transparency around data sharing and streamline the process? And then for these future directions, right now, these are ideas, things that we've got some pending grants in for, but if any of these are of interest to any of you, I would love for you to reach out. First, can different incentive structures be tested in vulnerable regions identified through spatial targeting? So what are the right incentive structures to actually get landowners on board when there's a specific region that's been identified? And then how can landscape metrics such as habitat connectivity be better integrated into program implementation? And then finally, expanding pollinator conservation to include nectar feeding bats in the Southwest. And thank you for listening. With that, I will take any questions. Thank you.
Okay, let's see. I will go in the chat. And Charlie, I think we may have just lost Charlie, but Charlie, if you come back, please do jump in. I think Charlie was going to prioritize. Thank you all. We have lots of questions. And there's Charlie. Okay, Charlie, I'll mute myself.
Yeah, sorry about that. It was funny. I just lost connection entirely there for a minute. Well, first of all, thanks everybody. Again, this is Charlie Rewa. I'm the wildlife component leader for SEEP, and I'm very impressed with the interaction that this webinar has generated from the audience. There's a whole lot of comments and questions going on there, and some of them sort of relate to sort of the model itself. And so, Elissa, could you just go back and tell folks again how these data were generated through the survey of pollinator experts with their best professional judgment on what kind of practices provide the natural habitat and the pollinator habitat, so folks can understand better, I think, what the modeling actually accomplished. Can we do that? Is Elissa still there?
Yep, sorry. Had to turn
Sure.
my mic back on. Yes, so this was the slide that talked about the expert elicitation survey and the 51 pollinator practices. And so we used a focus group and expert ranking to define and characterize these practices. You will find, if you follow the link for the report that goes with this table will be included, which shows a list of those 51 practices and how we categorize them. So this is the full list of the 51 practices that would be included in the analysis.
Okay, yeah, there's some of the comments. There's one comment here about their finding that tracts of semi-natural habitat can harbor high native bee diversity and abundant specialist host plants, even in intensified ag landscapes of the southern high plains. So I think that sort of speaks to generally what we're trying to model and look at where NRCS practices are applied. And there were a couple of other questions about, just because we have the practices there, do we have data that show that there's actually a pollinator response? And, a couple of comments from me, and we have a few different projects around the country. There's one in Missouri and a couple in New England and some in the Southeast that do look at pollinator response to specific practices. But Elissa, I don't know if you have anything else to add about, what we assume about pollinator response to the practices that we put out there.
Yeah, I would just add that it can be incredibly context specific, and there are, I'm going to say, probably hundreds of studies that do address those questions across specific contexts, as well as meta-analyses. And I don't think there's one clear answer that can quantify benefits of a specific practice, because it so depends on the pollinator communities and the surrounding landscape context.
Right. There's a question in here. Did the model take into account enrollment caps, or was this total potential land available in the landscape? I think maybe that might relate to CRP, but not the NRCS practices. Is that right?
Yes, we did not take into account enrollment caps. So in these, let's pull up those maps. These maps are just showing percent enrollment of eligible lands. So I guess I don't know what the caps are and how they differ across regions.
Yeah, I think that has probably to do more with CRP enrollment caps.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I guess I just have one more question of my own before we're about running out of time here. There's way more questions and comments than we can address, which I guess shows the interest in this topic. In your middle of the road scenario, you kind of show where in the corn belt, there's a natural, seems like in the next 100 years, there's a natural increase in pollinator habitat. Will that sort of help offset some of the loss of semi-natural habitat in that area, you think?
It certainly could. I just want to reiterate that these sorts of future scenarios about land use are incredibly diverse. So we chose, two different ones just kind of to illustrate the possibilities. But yeah, there are definitely areas where it's projected that there will be cropland abandonment, which results in an increase in semi-natural habitat loss. But then I guess that kind of raises the question about, well, then how will that change the, at least agricultural demand for pollination services in those areas?
Right. Well, we know that, like they say, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And we think this provides some useful information for us anyway, to at least start to think about the nationwide impact of our work on pollinator supply. So I think we're out of time, unfortunately. I think if there's other questions, you can address those to Creech. I think that she put her email in the chat to follow up with. So I'm going to turn it back over to Creech for some closing comments now. Thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you so much. It's kind of a fun problem to have more questions than we have time. So really want to thank you for your engagement. Thank you for the interest and for attending today. I also want to thank you, Dr. Olimpi, for putting this together. I know this was no small lift. And to Izzy Hill, I mean, coming during Pollinator Week and lending your time, that's huge. So thank you so much. I'll make this really quick because I know we're about to hit the top of the hour. If you have any questions about today's webinar, the most important thing I can say is please visit this webpage, and it'll also be available in the chat. We added it at the beginning of today's webinar. We'll add it again. but nrcs.usda.gov/conservation-outcomes-webinar. So you can get the webinar recording there. It'll be available by the beginning of July. We'll add these presentation slides. There's a sign-up link for our Gov delivery in case you're curious about other webinars. And you'll also see our 2024 calendar, so you can see what's coming down the road if you'd like to join us again, as we greatly hope you will. If you're curious about the Conservation Effects Assessment Project and the work we do with that as a whole, you can visit nrcs.usda.gov/CEAP. And again, if you have questions that weren't addressed today that you'd really like to connect on, please do email me. You can reach me at elizabeth.creech-thomas@usda.gov. So the last thing is a plug for our next webinar. August is Water Quality Month. We're really looking forward to a webinar on August 22nd at 2:00 p.m. Eastern, so same time, and it will be titled Yesterday's Phosphorus, Today's Water Quality, Conservation Insights from the USDA Legacy Phosphorus Assessment. So we hope to see you there. We thank you for your time. These are always fun. Hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thanks for joining us today. Bye, everyone.